You really don't need to have watched like a single frame of the show we're drawing our sources from today to feel the absolute just crushing weight of what it's trying to say.
Oh, absolutely not. You really don't.
Right. You only need to have lived long enough on this earth to realize that the world is infinitely more complicated than the bedtime stories you were told as a child.
Yeah, those neat little categories of good and evil.
Exactly. You just need to have lived long enough to have been fiercely convinced that you were on the right side of something like a political cause or a deeply held belief, maybe a moral argument, only to discover, much later, that the right side had done terrible, unspeakable things too.
And it's a profoundly disorienting realization. It's that exact moment when the moral architecture you've built your entire life around, well, it suddenly shows its cracks.
Right, you realize you might have wanted something so desperately that you completely stopped asking whether the wanting itself was the problem.
Yes, and maybe in that pursuit of safety or certainty, you built a wall.
A wall around something you loved.
Exactly. Maybe it was a relationship, or maybe your own vulnerability or an ideology you just couldn't afford to question. You built it and you called it protection.
But then time passes, and eventually you have to look at that massive structure you constructed and ask a pretty terrifying question, which is, am I actually keeping the danger out? Or did I just lock myself in?
That is the core of it.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a massive stack of sources. We've got lore analysis, character studies, extensive philosophical breakdowns, surrounding a story that, honestly, many people dismiss at surface level, which is Attack on Titan.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to extract the philosophical architecture of human conflict that this story just painstakingly maps out. We're not doing a recap of a show about giants eating people.
No, definitely not.
The giants, as our sources detail, they're merely the physical manifestation of the systemic pressures that act upon us all. We're diving into the inescapable human dilemmas encoded within this narrative.
Right, we're going to explore the core philosophical lessons this narrative spent years building, the true cost of absolute freedom, the banality of monsters, the architecture of societal control, and that harrowing difference between merely surviving and actually living.
It's heavy stuff.
It really is. And I want to add a quick note here for you, the listener, before we plunge into this. The source material deals with incredibly heavy, politically charged themes. We're talking systemic oppression, fascism, retaliation, historical cycles of genocide.
Yeah, themes that echo our real world a bit too closely sometimes.
Very closely. So our goal today is to impartially analyze how these concepts are utilized within the text to explore human nature. We aren't here to take sides on real-world political parallels. We're just trying to look clearly at the terrifying reflections this story offers us about how power and fear operate.
And this deep dive, it's explicitly designed for you if you've ever lived inside a system. And, well, you have. We all have.
Right, you can't escape them.
Exactly. Whether that system is a family structure, a corporate hierarchy, a sovereign country, or even just a rigid version of your own identity.
Oh, yeah. Identity as a system.
If you've ever lived inside one of those and sensed a quiet, persistent itch at the back of your mind, like the feeling that something crucial was being left unsaid, that the rules didn't quite make sense, then this exploration is for you. The source material says the quiet parts out loud, and it does it in a totally uncompromising way.
So let's start with the most immediate physical manifestation of this idea in the text, which is the walls themselves. In our source material, we have this society, the people of Parades, living inside these massive concentric walls.
50 meters high, keeping the world out.
Right, and outside the walls, there are literal monsters. Inside the walls, they're safe. They have agriculture, commerce, homes. They are, by all functional definitions, surviving. They are perfectly protected.
But, and this is a big but, when we move from the physical walls of this fictional story to the philosophical walls of our daily lives, we hit this massive tension. Surviving is just a biological baseline. It is not the same thing as living.
No, it's not. But systems are almost exclusively designed to blur the line between the two, right? Until you can't even tell the difference anymore.
Exactly. The people inside those fictional walls are kept alive. The government, the military, the dominant religion, every institution is entirely optimized for that survival. It keeps the population stable, fed, and utterly ignorant of the true nature of the outside world.
Utterly ignorant.
And to really understand the tragedy of this, our sources point to the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill. He made a fascinating distinction in his work on utilitarianism that this story just dramatizes perfectly. He separated human experience into lower pleasures and higher pleasures.
I am familiar with this framing, and it's so relevant here. Mill's lower pleasures are essentially the baseline requirements and comforts of existence.
Yeah, exactly. They're comfortable, stable, reliable.
And crucially, they require absolutely nothing from you except the basic capacity to receive them, like food, physical safety, passive entertainment. It's the pleasure of a life that fits perfectly inside its designated container.
That's a great way to put it. The people of paradise have their lower pleasures met. The system guarantees it, provided they don't ask too many questions.
Provided they stay in line.
Right. The lower pleasures are basically maintenance. And the moment you start asking questions, the moment you look at the wall and wonder what's on the other side, you are reaching for what Mill calls the higher pleasures.
Which are inherently difficult.
Very difficult. They require developed capacities. We're talking about the ability to think critically, the willingness to engage with profound complexity, and, this is key, the endurance to tolerate immense uncertainty.
Because asking questions means you might not like the answers.
Exactly. The pleasure of genuine understanding, of authentic choice, of true freedom, these are higher pleasures. Mill famously argued that a being capable of higher pleasures who settles only for lower ones has lost something fundamentally essential to their nature.
Right, didn't he say something about a pig?
He said, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
That makes me think of an analogy. Imagine you build this absolute state-of-the-art zoo enclosure for a wild animal. I mean, you spare no expense.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The temperature is perfectly regulated, the food is nutritionally optimal and delivered on this strict, reliable schedule. There are absolutely no predators, no droughts, no diseases. The glass is incredibly thick and spotless. Functionally, biologically, that animal will live twice as long as it would in the wild.
It's perfectly alive.
Right, but if you watch it, it's pacing. It is just endlessly pacing the perimeter of the glass because it has been entirely stripped of its natural behaviors, its agency, its need to struggle and overcome. It is surviving perfectly, but it isn't living.
That is a chillingly accurate analogy. The system of the walls in Paradise was explicitly engineered to provide lower pleasures in order to keep the population manageable.
Because a satisfied animal doesn't test the glass.
Exactly. A population that is capable of full humanity, a population exercising its higher pleasures, seeking truth, engaging in critical thought, that population becomes inherently dangerous to the system managing it.
They demand more.
They ask harder questions.
Yeah.
They're not easily managed. So the system, and often this is out of bureaucratic expediency rather than cartoonish evil, actively suppresses those higher pleasures.
Let me play devil's advocate here, though. If I'm looking out the window of my house and there is a literal 50-foot man-eating monster walking down my street,
You're locking the door.
I am absolutely locking the door. I'm building a wall. I'm going to embrace those lower pleasures of safety because survival is the absolute necessary prerequisite for living. Can we really fault a system or fault a person for prioritizing survival when the world is legitimately filled with threats?
It's a very fair point.
Like, without the wall, there's no philosophy, there's no self-actualization, there's just being eaten.
It is the most rational pushback, and honestly, it's the exact justification every restrictive system in human history uses. Survival is the prerequisite. The flaw in the logic, however, is that systems often convince us that survival is not just the foundation, but the ceiling.
Oh, wow. The ceiling.
Yeah. They convince us that the state of emergency is permanent, and therefore the restriction must be permanent. If we look at the listener's daily life, we see this constantly. Think about modern institutions.
Right, like corporate structures.
Or highly rigid social groups. These systems are heavily optimized for their own survival, for compliance, for measurable productivity. They are absolutely not optimized for your flourishing.
That's a vital distinction. The system wants you to be a productive worker, a compliant citizen, a predictable consumer. It wants you to stay in the zoo enclosure, enjoy the regulated temperature, and definitely not tap on the glass. And it frames your compliance as safety.
Exactly. And the profound lesson here is that the system will never voluntarily tell you the difference between surviving and living.
It's never going to give you permission to leave.
It will never tap you on the shoulder and say, you know, the state of emergency is over, you are safe now, you can start self-actualizing. Optimization for flourishing is entirely your own responsibility.
So you have to be the one to recognize when the wall that kept you safe during a vulnerable period of your life, maybe a defense mechanism you built during childhood, or a highly structured job you took when you were desperate, is now the very thing preventing you from growing.
Yes. But if our minds are boxed in by these systems, and the natural human impulse is eventually to smash the box, how does this system stop us?
Right, because you don't keep people perfectly compliant in a zoo enclosure just by locking the door. Eventually, people get restless.
They do. To keep them truly pacified, to keep them from realizing they're only surviving and not living, you have to control what they believe about the outside world. You have to build an architecture of the mind.
Which brings us to the mechanics of societal control, a theme our source material explores with terrifying precision. The transition from physical walls to psychological walls is where the story elevates into a masterpiece of political philosophy.
It really does.
Because inside the walls of Paradis, the ruling king literally used a supernatural power to erase the memories of the entire population. He wiped their historical slate clean and implanted a new narrative. Humanity perished outside the walls. We're the last survivors. The walls are our only salvation.
He physically altered their cognition. But outside the walls, in the nation of Marley, they didn't have magic memory erasure.
No magic required.
No, they just used cultural narratives and relentless generational propaganda to justify the brutal oppression of an entire race of people.
Erasing history and shaping the narrative. When I think about this through the lens of philosophy, it always brings me straight to Michel Foucault.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Foucault dedicated his life to examining how societies define truth, and his work on epistemology seems like the exact blueprint for both Paradis and Marley. He argued that what a society considers to be true is never just a pure, objective reflection of reality.
It's always tied to power.
Exactly. It's a reflection of who has the power to define it and what serves their institutional interests.
Foucault's relationship between knowledge and power is essential here. If you control the knowledge available, you control the boundaries of reality for your subjects. And he wasn't saying the objective reality doesn't exist or that, gravity is a social construct.
Right.
He was saying that the version of the truth made available to you, the historical narratives taught in schools, the social norms, the medical definitions of what is normal or criminal, these are shaped by forces that have a vested interest in the truth taking that particular shape.
So if you wake up and the government tells you the world outside your city is empty, and there are absolutely no books, no records, and no dissenters to contradict it, that is reality. Your reality is bounded by their power.
Yes. The king's memory wipe is just Foucault's theory made literal and supernatural.
But Marley is even more terrifying because it's realistic. They don't use magic. They use education, internment zones, armbands, and constant reinforcement to teach the oppressed Eldians that they are inherently evil, that they carry the blood of devils. They manufacture a truth.
And this connects perfectly to Antonio Gramsci, doesn't it?
It does. Foucault explains the power of knowledge, but Gramsci explains how it gets embedded into the daily lives of regular people.
Exactly. Gramsci, writing from a prison cell in fascist Italy, observed how the ruling class maintains control. He realized they don't always need to use violence.
Violence is expensive.
Expensive and unstable. Instead, they use ideology. He termed it cultural hegemony. This is the insidious process by which the specific values, the specific worldview, and the specific historical narratives of the dominant group become the assumed, unquestioned common sense of the entire society.
Including the oppressed.
Including the oppressed.
And the mechanics of that are what make it so devastating. How does a dominant class make their propaganda feel like common sense? They don't just put up posters. They embed it in the family unit.
Right. They make the parents enforce it.
Yes, they make the parents enforce the rules out of fear for their children's safety. They create an incentive structure where self-hatred is actually rewarded. In Marley, an oppressed Eldian who fully internalizes the propaganda that they are the devil and pledges their life to the fascist military is granted the title of honorary Marleyan.
The system weaponizes their own desire for dignity against them.
Exactly. And that is why common sense is arguably the most dangerous phrase in the political dictionary. When an ideology achieves cultural hegemony, it no longer looks like an ideology. It just looks like reality.
It feels like the weather.
Yes. In our source material, the Marleyans who actively oppress the Eldians do not wake up every morning twirling their mustaches, thinking of themselves as evil oppressors. They experience themselves as realists.
They believe they are acting on the objective historical record to protect the world. And similarly, the Church of the Walls inside Paradis doesn't experience itself as a tool of a tyrannical government. It experiences itself as the faithful guardian of something sacred.
So if you are listening to this and thinking that this all sounds like a recipe for total paranoia, you aren't alone. I mean, if everything is a narrative constructed by power, if our common sense is just cultural hegemony, the natural instinct is to become incredibly cynical.
To just assume everyone is lying.
Exactly, to assume everyone is manipulating you and to check out entirely. But the text gives us a direct counter to that cynicism, primarily through the character of Erwin Smith. Erwin doesn't respond to the lies of his government with cynicism. He responds with a weaponized form of curiosity.
Cynicism is ultimately just another form of compliance. It assumes everything is a lie and therefore it stops engaging. It's a form of intellectual surrender disguised as superiority.
Oh, that's good. The system loves a cynic.
It does, because a cynic will never organize a resistance. Erwin Smith represents the antidote: relentless, agonizing curiosity. Curiosity assumes that things are infinitely more complex than they've been presented, and it commits to continually asking questions.
Questions like, who decided I should know this?
Exactly. What do they need from me, knowing it in this exact way? What might be on the other side of the wall they built around this particular piece of reality?
Cynics stop walking when they hit a wall, cross their arms, and claim the whole world is a prison. The curious person walks up to the wall, examines the bricks, looks for weaknesses in the mortar, and wonders what the warden is so terrified of hiding.
That's the difference.
And I want to direct this right to you, the listener. Think about your own life. Think about the assumptions that feel entirely natural and obvious to you. The things you accept as just the way it is.
The things you don't even question.
Right. Maybe it's how a career path is supposed to look. Maybe it's the definition of a successful relationship or deeply held convictions about how the economy functions. The challenge here is to realize that those invisible, comfortable assumptions are exactly where hidden ideologies live.
They hide in plain sight.
The ideologies most worth examining in your own life are not the ones that feel obviously wrong to you. Those are easy. The ones you need to interrogate are the ones that feel like the law of gravity.
But here is the danger, and this is where the narrative shifts from a philosophical thought experiment into a tragedy.
Here we go.
When you finally see through that common sense, when you finally recognize the invisible walls around your mind, the natural human impulse is to smash the box. You demand to break out. You want freedom.
Who wouldn't?
Right. But as the story warns us, when we finally get out, the resulting pursuit of freedom becomes incredibly, devastatingly dangerous.
Because what actually happens when you get out? You realize the world isn't an empty playground waiting for you. It's full of other people with their own walls and their own demands for freedom. Which brings us to the core obsession of the entire narrative, the calculus of freedom.
The central theme.
Everything we've talked about so far, the physical walls, the psychological walls, the mechanics of control, it all builds to this. The main character, Eren, wants freedom at absolutely all costs. The Survey Corps, the military branch dedicated to exploring outside the walls, literally dies for it. The word freedom is invoked constantly.
But the story takes everything we think we know about freedom in popular culture and turns it into a nightmare. Most narratives treat freedom as an unalloyed good.
Right, the shining destination at the end of the hero's journey.
Exactly, the thing that retroactively justifies every sacrifice made along the way. But this source material argues something much darker and honestly much more structurally sound. It argues that freedom is not a destination. It's a condition that always inevitably exists in violent tension with something else.
It exists in tension with safety.
With safety, with societal stability, and most tragically, with other people's freedom. To truly understand this, we need to apply the framework established by Isaiah Berlin in his 1958 essay, Two Concepts of Liberty.
Berlin's work is basically the skeleton key to this whole tragedy. He proposed two distinct concepts of freedom: negative freedom and positive freedom. Let's break down the mechanics of these, because while they sound like academic jargon, they're incredibly visceral in practice. Let's start with negative freedom.
Right, so negative freedom is essentially freedom from interference. It's freedom from constraints, from obstacles, from walls. It's the absence of an external force telling you what you cannot do or where you cannot go.
Taking the chains off.
Yes. When Eren screams that he wants to be free, for the vast majority of the story, he is talking about negative freedom. He wants the physical walls gone. He wants the titans outside the walls gone. And later, when he discovers that the rest of the world wants his people dead, he wants those oppressors across the ocean gone. He wants the absolute removal of any threat to his autonomy.
Okay, so negative freedom is taking the chains off. What is positive freedom?
Positive freedom is freedom too. It is the freedom to develop, to self-actualize, to become the master of your own life and build genuine meaning. It is agency and capacity.
So having the means to do something once the chains are off.
Exactly. If negative freedom is taking the chains off a person, positive freedom is that person having the resources, the education, and the opportunity to actually walk somewhere meaningful. Berlin's brilliant and terrifying observation was that these two forms of freedom are not just different, they are often perpetually at war with one another.
I want to use an analogy to illustrate the tension here because it's vital we understand how these two concepts collide. Let's say we are all in a crowded, stuffy room. The air is incredibly thick and I feel suffocated. I decide that I need absolute negative freedom. I need freedom from this bad air, freedom from having to share my breathing space with all of you.
I see where this is going.
Right, I want zero constraints on my lungs. So I invent a machine that sucks all the oxygen out of the room and funnels it directly into my own personal diving helmet. I have achieved absolute negative freedom. No one is interfering with my breathing.
But the cost.
The cost of my negative freedom lands squarely and lethally on everyone else's lungs. I have completely destroyed their positive freedom, their freedom to live, to speak, to exist. I maximized my freedom, and the cost was their lives.
That is a brutally effective analogy, and it maps flawlessly onto the climax of the source material. Eren pursues negative freedom to its absolute, horrifying logical limit. He wants freedom from any potential future threat to his people on Paradise.
He wants the oxygen all to himself.
So what does he do? He initiates an apocalyptic event called the Rumbling. He unleashes thousands of colossal titans to literally trample the rest of the world into dust. The cost of his absolute negative freedom is the annihilation of 800 million lives. He utterly, permanently destroys the positive freedom of 800 million people so that his small group will never experience interference again.
It's the ultimate horrifying calculus. You cannot maximize your freedom without it costing someone else. And the show never lets you look away from the bodies that pile up to pay that cost.
It refuses to look away.
Earlier on, the Survey Corps chose the positive freedom to know what was outside the walls, to seek the truth. And the cost of that pursuit was measured in the literal torn bodies of young soldiers. Later, Eren chooses negative freedom from oppression, and the cost is a global genocide. It forces a question that our highly individualistic culture almost never asks.
It really does. It poses an inescapable question to you, the listener. Whenever you choose to expand your own freedom, whether that's the freedom to speak without a filter, the freedom to consume whatever resources you want, or the freedom to prioritize your desires over your community's needs, who is paying the cost for your expansion?
Because someone is.
Someone is always paying. Freedom is not free, not in the patriotic bumper sticker sense, but in the laws of physics sense. It requires space, and space is always occupied by something or someone else. Did the people paying the cost of your freedom consent to that transaction?
If my freedom to buy incredibly cheap goods is paid for by the loss of positive freedom for exploited workers halfway across the globe, well, they certainly didn't consent.
Exactly.
My negative freedom to keep my money in my pocket comes at the cost of their positive freedom to live with dignity. But to live with that reality, to be willing to let others pay the heavy price for our freedom, we have to do something psychologically very dark.
We have to distance ourselves.
We have to mentally turn those other people into something less than human to justify it. We cannot suffocate people if we see them as equals. We have to shatter the mirror.
And that leads us directly into the most psychologically devastating dynamic in the entire story. The relationship between the protagonist, Eren, and one of the primary antagonists, Reiner.
This dynamic is just, it's everything.
It is. Early in the story, Reiner is the monster. He's the one who breaches the wall in the very first episode, causing the death of thousands of innocent people, including Eren's mother. He is the architect of Eren's trauma. He is the categorical other.
But as the story unfolds, the perspective shifts dramatically. The narrative takes us across the ocean, and we see Reiner's life.
We see behind the curtain.
And what we see completely shatters our understanding of the conflict. Reiner wasn't a mustache-twirling villain who loved evil. He was a child. He was an oppressed minority living in an internment zone in Marley. We see the mechanics of Gramsci's cultural hegemony at work on him.
He is victim of it?
Completely.
Yeah.
He was manipulated by a fascist state, brainwashed by propaganda, and deployed as a child soldier. The system offered him a devil's bargain. Become a weapon for us, break this wall, kill these devils, and maybe we'll let your family be treated as honorary humans. So Reiner destroyed a civilization, and Reiner was a traumatized, manipulated child. Both of those things are true at the exact same time.
Both are entirely true simultaneously without canceling each other out.
Yeah.
And this is where the source material demands immense intellectual maturity from its audience. Hmm. It refuses to let the explanation for Reiner's actions become an excuse for his atrocities.
Right. Explanation isn't justification.
But it also adamantly refuses to let the absence of an excuse become a reason to stop seeking the explanation. To navigate this tension, we have to look at the political philosopher Hannah Arendt.
Arndt's concept of the banality of evil. It's one of those phrases that gets thrown around a lot in pop psychology, but what does it actually mean in the context of systems manufacturing monsters out of ordinary people?
Well, Arendt developed this concept while covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief bureaucrats and architects of the Holocaust. What shocked Arendt, and really what terrified the world, was that Eichmann did not present himself as a raving demonic monster.
He didn't have glowing red eyes?
Exactly. He seemed remarkably distressingly ordinary. He was a bureaucrat, he was thoughtless, eager to please his superiors, and entirely consumed by the mechanics of his job train schedules, quotas, logistics, rather than its horrifying moral implications.
Just following orders.
Just following the rules. The banality of evil is the observation that history's worst atrocities are often not committed by incomprehensible psychopaths. They are committed by ordinary, banal people who are simply following the logic of their deeply flawed world to its ultimate conclusion.
Which is, frankly, that is not a comforting thought at all. We want our villains to look like monsters. We want them to laugh maniacally and embrace darkness, because if they are fundamentally different from us, we're safe.
Right, it creates a boundary.
If they are monsters, then we as ordinary people are safe from ever becoming them.
It is a psychological protective mechanism. But this story strips that protection away completely. The capacity for atrocity is not safely quarantined in a specific category of evil people. It's distributed.
It's in everyone.
It is latent in the human condition, waiting for the right systemic pressure, the right combination of fear, ideology, and incremental normalization. The Marleyan commanders, the child soldiers like Reiner, even Eren himself at the end, none of them are incomprehensible. That is the true horror. They are the product of forces that, had they been applied to you or me, might have produced the exact same results.
Okay, but I have to jump in here and really wrestle with the discomfort of this truth. Because if we explain horrific actions entirely as the product of systems and pressure, if we say, well, Reiner was just a product of Marleyan fascism or Eichmann was just following the bureaucracy, don't we risk completely removing personal accountability?
That's the danger of that line of thinking, yes.
Right. Don't we risk excusing the inexcusable? If everyone is just a victim of their environment who is responsible, how do we hold the tension that an explanation is not an absolution?
It is the hardest tightrope walk in ethics. The philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel gives us a framework here with his concept of the dialectic, specifically the master-slave dialectic and the struggle for recognition. Hegel viewed history as a process driven by the clash of opposing forces.
Okay, opposing forces clashing.
But before these forces can resolve into something new, they must go through a painful process of recognition. They must look at each other and realize that the enemy is not an alien. The enemy is a mirror. Accountability begins with recognition.
The mirror. When Marleyans committed atrocities against Eldians, it was only possible because they had systematically dehumanized them. They literally called them island devils. You can't commit genocide against a mirror. You can only do it to a monster. You have to remove their humanity to justify your cruelty.
Exactly. The insistence that the enemy is fundamentally, biologically, or morally different from you is the necessary prerequisite for atrocity. But in one of the most powerful, quiet scenes in the entire narrative, Eren infiltrates Marley. He goes into the basement of a building during a festival, sits down across from Reiner, the man who destroyed his life, who got his mother killed, and after listening to Reiner confess his weakness and his brainwashing, Eren says, "I understand you now. We are the same."
We are the same. Just, wow. He realizes that if he had been born in that internment zone, fed that exact same propaganda, and given those exact same agonizing choices to protect his family, he would have broken the wall too. It's a terrifying moment of empathy.
It's a Hegel's moment of absolute recognition. Eren sees the mirror. And this forces you, the listener, to sit with a deeply uncomfortable proposition. The most vital moral question is not who is the enemy.
That's too easy.
Far too easy to point fingers at the system or the opposing side. The question that requires actual courage is, under what circumstances would I become the enemy? What specific combination of fear for my family, economic desperation, and cultural propaganda would it take for me to justify the unjustifiable?
Understanding that doesn't excuse the person who pulls the trigger.
No, it simply maps out how the gun was loaded so we might prevent it from happening again.
But the tragic, gut-wrenching irony of the story is that even after Eren recognizes that Reiner is his mirror, he still moves forward with the violence. Empathy doesn't stop the war.
It doesn't.
Because once both sides have thoroughly convinced themselves that the other is an existential threat, and once the blood has been spilled, the logical next step is a perpetual, grinding cycle of violence. The machine is already in motion. Which brings us to our final theme, the terrifying logic of the cycle of violence and what it actually costs to break it.
The brutal logic of historical cycles is mathematically sound within its own parameters. Let's look at the lore. Marley oppressed Eldia. So when Eldia gained the power of the Titans, they oppressed Marley for centuries.
And then Marley strikes back.
Right, so Marley, terrified of Eldia's return, oppressed them harder, turning them into second-class citizens and weapons of war. And Eldia, cornered and facing absolute extermination, prepares to destroy Marley entirely. At every single stage, both sides have incredibly legitimate grievances.
They both have mass graves they can point to.
And at every stage, they use those very real grievances to justify the next escalation.
It's the logic of deterrence taken to its absolute apocalyptic conclusion. The lesson that the previous generation's violence teaches the current generation is simply this: safety requires superior force. The only way to guarantee you won't be the victim is to become the one doing the victimizing, to strike first and to strike harder.
It is the negative freedom we talked about earlier, weaponized on a global scale.
Completely irrational within the closed loop of the cycle.
And that is why cycles do not break themselves. The math of vengeance always balances perfectly. An eye for an eye until everyone is blind. To break a cycle of violence, someone, somewhere, has to make a deeply, fundamentally irrational choice. They have to choose to absorb a cost that is not theirs to pay. They have to let the math remain unbalanced.
I want to highlight some of the characters who do this, because amidst all the grimness and the horror of the rumbling, this is where the profound beauty of the story lies. You have Armin, who repeatedly risks his life and eventually is willing to die just to try and talk, to reach out to Eren, to absorb the violence without returning it.
And Heng.
Yes, Heng, who sacrifices herself against the colossal Titans to buy a few seconds of time for the Alliance, absorbing the cost of history's failures so the next generation might have a chance to fix it. You have Historia, who refuses the government's plan to sacrifice her own children to maintain the Titan inheritance, choosing to absorb the political vulnerability of that decision rather than pass the generational trauma down to her kids.
These are acts of quiet, staggering heroism. They are refusing to pass the pain backward or forward. But the emotional and philosophical climax of this idea is embodied by Commander Erwin Smith.
The suicide charge.
Earlier in the story, Erwin leads what is essentially a suicide charge against the Beast Titan. The Beast Titan is hurling supersonic crushed rocks at them, annihilating the soldiers. There is no strategic way out. Erwin does not promise his soldiers they will survive. He explicitly tells them they are riding to their deaths, but they follow him anyway.
Why?
To understand this, we need to turn to the mid-20th century French existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel.
Marcel makes this incredible distinction between two words we usually use interchangeably in everyday conversation: optimism and hope. But they aren't the same, are they?
They're not the same thing at all. In fact, in extreme situations, they're almost opposites. Marcel argued that optimism is essentially a conditional calculation. It is a prediction based on the available evidence.
Like looking at the odds.
You look at the data, you look at the historical trends, you weigh your resources, and you conclude things will probably work out. We have a good chance. Optimism requires favorable evidence to sustain itself. If the math turns against you, optimism instantly evaporates.
Exactly. If I am playing a game and I have a 90% chance of winning, I am optimistic. But if I am on a horse and a giant monkey is throwing a barrage of boulders at me at Mach 1 and I have a literal 0% chance of survival, my optimism collapses. There is no math that saves me. But hope never relied on the math in the first place.
Precisely. Hope, according to Marcel, is not a calculation. It is an orientation of the spirit. It is a profound commitment to act as if the future matters, entirely independent of the evidence. It is the defiance of the odds.
So Erwin wasn't optimistic.
Erwin Smith was not an optimistic man. He was a brutal realist who knew they were all going to die on that field. But he was profoundly hopeful. He chose to act as if their death meant something, as if the pursuit of the truth and the survival of humanity was worth the absolute ultimate price, even if you would never live to see it.
We needed a good metaphor for this, and the one that strikes me is this. Optimism is expecting a reply. when you send a text message to your friend. Hope is building a transmitter and sending a radio signal out into the deep, dark void of space.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
You aren't calculating the odds of an alien civilization receiving it, decoding it, and sending a message back in your lifetime. The math on that is basically zero. You aren't doing it for a guaranteed return on investment. You are sending the signal because the act of reaching out into the dark, the act of declaring, we are here and we matter, is fundamentally necessary to being human.
Yes.
You are absorbing the immense labor of building the transmitter so that maybe 1,000 years from now, someone you will never meet might hear it and know they aren't alone.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. You are transmitting into the void because the alternative is silence. And to connect this back to you, the listener, the cycles in our own world operate on the same unforgiving logic.
They really do.
Whether we are talking about massive geopolitical conflicts, systemic social inequalities, or just deeply entrenched interpersonal toxicity within your own family, these cycles do not magically resolve themselves over time. Time does not heal all wounds. Left untreated, time often just infects them.
So true.
These cycles only break when someone, usually the person who has been hurt the most, chooses to absorb an unfair cost. When they say, I have every right to strike back, I have every right to carry this grievance forward, I have the receipts to prove I was wrong, but I choose to let the violence end with me. It is an agonizing, deeply unfair burden.
It's the most unfair thing in the world. Why should the victim have to absorb the cost of the perpetrator's actions to break the cycle? It defied every instinct we have for retributive justice. It feels like letting the bad guy win.
It does defy our instinct for retributive justice. But the alternative is the rumbling. The alternative is the continuation of the cycle of escalation until there's absolutely nothing left to destroy. The willingness to absorb that unfair cost, to act with Marcel's hope in service of a future you might not even live to see, is perhaps the most elevated moral act a human being is capable of.
It's the only honest answer the story offers to the immense darkness it depicts.
Exactly. It doesn't promise a utopian happy ending, but it promises that the effort to break the cycle is the only thing that gives our lives meaning.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by looking at the comfortable lower pleasures that keep us pacified inside our own personal and societal walls, merely surviving instead of truly living. We explored the terrifying architecture of the mind with Foucault and Gramsci, seeing how common sense can mask the most insidious cultural hegemony, and how relentless curiosity is our only weapon against it.
And we dissected the devastating calculus of freedom with Isaiah Berlin.
Right, realizing that our demand for negative freedom almost always costs someone else their positive freedom.
We also confronted the banality of monsters with Hannah Arendt, using Hegel's mirror to recognize that the capacity for atrocity exists within us all, dictated by the systems and pressures we inhabit. And finally, we looked at the agonizing necessity of hope, not a calculated optimism, but a defiant hope, and the deeply unfair costs required to break the cycles of harm that define our history.
It's heavy. It is undeniably a heavy reflection. But as we said at the start, you don't need to know the plot of the story to feel its weight. You just have to live in the world. You just have to look at the systems around you.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Building on that tension between positive and negative freedom, I want you to think about the deepest grievance you hold right now. Think of a place in your life, whether in your personal relationships, your workplace, or your political worldview, where you feel someone else's freedom infringed upon yours, where you were legitimately wronged.
Are you currently using that legitimate grievance to justify building a new wall?
Exactly. Are you demanding an absolute negative freedom that will suck the oxygen out of the room for someone else? And if so, I want you to ask yourself one question. When that wall is finally finished, will you be the warden or will you be the prisoner?
Until next time, keep questioning the walls you see and, more importantly, the ones you don't. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.